He wasn't looking for history, just repairs. The job was simple enough. Fetch the old county records from the ghost jail in Elkrun, find the ledger entry for the courthouse construction in 46, and use it to settle a dispute over lumber costs. Callum, apprentice to a man who built saddles that would outlast the horses that wore them, had a steady hand for details, a quiet way that made folks trust him with their ledgers and their leather. The old jail smelled of dust and dead mice, a scent that clung to the dry, splintering wood of the walls. Sunlight fell in hard, bright shafts through the grimy windows, illuminating swirling motes of what might have been skin or wood or forgotten time. The town used it for storage now, a place for things no one wanted but couldn't bring themselves to throw away. Broken chairs, stacks of yellowed newspapers, a child's rocking horse with one rocker split clean through. It was a tomb of good intentions. The ledgers were stacked on a shelf in the old sheriff's office, thick leather-bound books with spines cracked like river mud in a drought. Callum ran his fingers over them, the leather cool and smooth beneath his calloused skin. He found the one marked 45, 47, and carried it to the sheriff's desk, the only clear surface in the room. He sat in the old chair, the wood groaning under his weight, and opened the book. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. He turned them carefully, the silence of the room broken only by the whisper of paper and the distant caw of a crow. He ran his finger down the columns of names and figures, his eyes scanning for courthouse. He found entries for a new well, for road repairs, for a bounty on a wolf that had been harassing the ranchers. He kept turning, the sun moving across the floor, the shafts of light growing longer, warmer. He was a man who lived in the present, who found his purpose in the clean slice of a knife through leather, the satisfying pull of a waxed thread stitched tight. The past was a foreign country, a place he'd never had a map for. He was an orphan, raised by the church, until he was old enough to work, a boy with no story but the one he was living day by day. He'd never felt the lack of it, not really. A man was what he made himself, not where he came from, or so he'd always believed. He turned a page, and his finger stopped. The date at the top was January 3rd, 1848, his own birthday. He'd been left on the steps of the church that morning, a newborn wrapped in a thin blanket with no note, no name, nothing to say who he was or why he was there. The priest had named him Callum for the dove, a symbol of peace in a world that had offered him none. He'd never thought to ask about the day itself, had never considered that his own beginning might be written down in a book like this. He wasn't looking for himself, he was looking for lumber. But his eyes were drawn down the page, past the entries for drunk and disorderlies, for a stolen horse, for a fight in the saloon. And then he saw it. The name was scratched faint, the ink watery and thin, as if the pen had been running dry or the hand that held it had been trembling. But it was there, Rowena Thorne. Beneath it, in the column for the charge, was a single stark word: vagrancy. And next to that, in the column for the outcome, another: released. He stared at the name, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. He'd heard the name before, whispered in the back of his mind, a ghost of a memory he couldn't place. Rowena. It was a pretty name, a name that belonged to a woman in a storybook, not a woman in a jailhouse ledger. He traced the letters with his finger, the paper rough beneath his touch. Rowena Thorne. He said the name aloud, the sound strange and unfamiliar in the silent room. It felt like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. He looked at the date again. January 3rd. The day he was born. The day a woman named Rowena Thorne was released from the Elkrun jail. Coincidence? It had to be. There were 1,000 reasons for a woman to be in jail, 1,000 reasons for a baby to be abandoned. The two things had nothing to do with each other. He tried to turn the page, to go back to his search for the courthouse, for the lumber, for the simple, uncomplicated present. But his hand wouldn't move. His eyes were fixed on the name, on the date, on the stark, brutal facts of the ledger. He felt a tremor start deep inside him, a shifting of the ground beneath his feet. The world he had built for himself, the world of leather and thread and the steady, reliable rhythm of his work, suddenly felt thin and fragile, a sheet of ice over a dark, deep water. He closed the book, the sound of the heavy cover slamming shut echoing in the silence. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. He had to know. He had to find out who Rowena Thorne was and why her name was in this book on the day of his birth. He walked out of the jail, the sunlight blinding after the dimness of the office. He didn't go back to the saddlery. He went to find Doc Finch. Doc Finch was as much a fixture in Elkrun as the mountains that ringed the valley. He'd been the town's only doctor for 40 years, had brought most of its citizens into the world and seen a good many of them out of it. His office was a cluttered, chaotic place, smelling of antiseptic and old paper and the faint, sweet scent of the pipe he was always smoking. He was sitting at his desk, a pair of spectacles perched on the end of his nose, reading a medical journal. He looked up as Callum came in, his eyes, magnified by the thick lenses, kind and questioning. "Callum, what can I do for you? Your master not working you hard enough?" Callum stood by the door, the jailhouse ledger still clutched in his hand. He felt a strange reluctance to speak, to give voice to the question that was burning in his throat. "Doc, I was in the old jail, looking for something for Mr. Abernathy." The doctor nodded, his eyes patient. "And I found this." Callum opened the ledger on the corner of the doctor's desk, his finger pointing to the entry. "Rowena Thorne. Do you know that name?" Doc Finch took off his spectacles, his face suddenly serious. He leaned forward, his eyes squinting at the faded ink. He was silent for a long time, so long that Callum began to think he didn't know, that the name was as much a mystery to him as it was to Callum. Then the doctor sighed, a long, slow exhalation of breath that seemed to carry the weight of years with it. "Rowena Thorne," he said, his voice soft. "I haven't heard that name in a long time." He looked up at Callum, his eyes searching the boy's face, as if seeing him for the first time. "She had eyes like yours," he said, "the same color, a kind of gray-blue, like the sky before a storm." Callum felt a jolt, a shock of recognition that went through him like a current. He'd always wondered where his eyes came from. They were different from anyone else's in town, a strange, unsettling color that made people look away. "Who was she?" Callum asked, his voice barely a whisper. The doctor leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant, lost in memory. "She wasn't from around here. Showed up one day in the fall of 47, on the stage from the east. She was different. Quiet. Kept to herself. She had a sadness about her, a kind of stillness that was hard to read. She was with child." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and charged with meaning. Callum felt the blood drain from his face. "She was pregnant?" The doctor nodded. "Very pregnant. Looked like she was due any day. She took a room at the boarding house, paid in advance. Said she was waiting for her husband, that he was coming to meet her. But he never came." He paused, his eyes meeting Callum's. "Folks started to talk. You know how it is in a small town. A woman alone, with no husband in sight. They called her names, whispered behind her back." Callum could imagine it. He'd been the subject of whispers himself, the orphan boy with the strange eyes. He knew the sting of it, the way it could make you feel like a stranger in your own skin. "What happened to her?" he asked, his voice tight. "The winter was hard that year," the doctor said, his voice low. "The snow came early and stayed late. She ran out of money. The boarding house owner, a mean-spirited woman named Gable, threw her out. She had nowhere to go." He looked down at the ledger, his finger tracing the name. "Sheriff Miller found her sleeping in the livery stable. He had a good heart, Miller did. But he had to follow the law. He arrested her for vagrancy. Put her in the jail to give her a roof over her head at least." Callum looked at the date again. January 3rd. "And the baby?" he asked, his voice trembling. The doctor's eyes were full of a deep, old sadness. She went into labor that night, in the cell. I was there. It was a difficult birth. She was weak, malnourished, but she was strong, too. She fought for that baby. I'll never forget the sound of her scream. It was like it changed the weather, like the whole world went silent to listen to it. He looked at Callum, his gaze steady and unwavering. It was you, Callum. You were that baby. The room was silent, but for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Callum felt the world tilt on its axis, the floor dropping away from under him. He was that baby, the baby born in a jail cell to a woman who had been arrested for being poor and alone. The words were a blow, a physical force that knocked the breath out of him. He stumbled back, his hand reaching for the doorframe to steady himself. My mother, he whispered, the word feeling foreign and strange on his tongue. He'd never said it before. Mother. It was a word that belonged to other people, to the children he'd grown up with in the church, the ones who had homes and families and stories that stretched back for generations. He was Callum, the orphan, the boy from nowhere. But now he had a name, Rowena Thorne, and he had a story that began in a jail cell with a scream that changed the weather. What happened to her? He asked, his voice raw. Where is she? The doctor's face was grim. She was sick after the birth. A fever. I did what I could, but she was too weak. She held on for a few days. She held you, Callum. She looked at you with so much love. It was like the sun coming out from behind the clouds. She named you. She wanted to call you something else. But she was delirious with the fever. She kept saying a name. I couldn't make it out. He shook his head, his eyes full of regret. She died on the 6th of January. We buried her in the churchyard. There was no money for a stone, so the grave is unmarked. An unmarked grave. His mother was lying in an unmarked grave, forgotten by everyone but the old doctor who still remembered the color of her eyes. The anger came then, a hot, bitter wave that washed over him, burning away the shock and the grief. Anger at the town that had turned its back on her, at the woman who had thrown her out into the cold, at the husband who had never come. Anger at the world that had let a woman like Rowena Thorne die alone in a jail cell. He looked at the ledger, at the faint, scratched name. Rowena Thorne. It wasn't just a name anymore. It was a promise. He would find her grave. He would put a stone on it, with her name carved deep and clear, so that no one would ever forget her again. And he would find out who the man was, who had left her to die. He would find out the name she had tried to give him. He would find out the truth. He turned and walked out of the doctor's office, the ledger still in his hand. He didn't know where he was going or what he would do. He only knew that he couldn't go back to the life he had been living. He was no longer Callum, the saddlemaker's apprentice. He was the son of Rowena Thorne, and his life had just begun. He went back to the jail. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the dusty floor. The air was cold, the chill of the coming night seeping through the thin walls. He went to the cell where she had been, the one Doc Finch had described. It was at the end of the short corridor, the last one on the left. The door was ajar, the lock rusted and broken. He pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The cell was small, barely big enough for the narrow cot that was pushed against the far wall. A single high window, barred and covered in grime, let in a sliver of the dying light. This was where she had been. This was where she had given birth to him. This was where she had died. He ran his hand along the cold stone of the wall, trying to imagine her here, alone and afraid, her body racked with pain. He could almost hear her scream, the sound echoing in the silence of the empty cell. He knelt by the cot, the rough wool of the blanket scratching against his cheek. He could smell the faint, lingering scent of sickness and despair. He closed his eyes, trying to conjure her face, to see the woman with the storm-gray eyes that the doctor had described. But all he could see was the name in the ledger, the faint, watery ink, a testament to a life that had been erased. He stayed there for a long time, as the last of the light faded from the window and the cell was plunged into darkness. He didn't light a lamp. He wanted to feel the darkness, to share it with her, to understand the world she had inhabited in her final days. He felt a strange sense of peace in the darkness, a feeling of connection to the mother he had never known. He was a part of her, a continuation of her story, and he would not let that story end in an unmarked grave. He stood up, his legs stiff and cold. He knew what he had to do. He had to find the man who had abandoned her, the man who was his father. Doc Finch had said she was waiting for her husband. He had a name. He must have a name. He went back to the sheriff's office, his eyes now accustomed to the dark. He lit the lamp on the desk, the flame casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. He opened the ledger again, his hands trembling slightly. He turned to the page with his mother's name, his eyes scanning the other entries, looking for a clue, a name, anything that might lead him to the man he was looking for. He found nothing. The other names were all locals, men arrested for petty crimes, their stories as familiar and unremarkable as the dust on the shelves. He sat back in the chair, his hope beginning to fade. It had been 20 years. The man could be anywhere. He could be dead. He might never have existed at all, a figment of a desperate woman's imagination. He was about to close the book when his eyes caught something he hadn't seen before. A small, dark stain on the page, near the bottom, almost hidden in the crease of the binding. It looked like a blood stain, old and faded, but still visible in the lamplight. He leaned closer, his heart pounding in his chest. There was something written there, in a hand that was different from the sheriff's neat, careful script. The letters were small and cramped, as if written in haste or in secret. He had to squint to make them out. It was a name, a single name. Jasper. He stared at the name, the letters seeming to burn themselves into his brain. Jasper. Was this the name his mother had whispered in her delirium? The name of his father? He felt a surge of adrenaline, a renewed sense of purpose. He had a name. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He closed the ledger, his mind racing. He had to find out who Jasper was. He had to find out what had happened to him, why he had never come for Rowena. He took the ledger with him. It was his now, a part of his story. He walked out of the jail and into the cold, clear night. The stars were bright in the moonless sky, 1,000 tiny points of light in the vast, empty darkness. He looked up at them, feeling a sense of awe and wonder. He was no longer alone. He had a mother, a father, a name, he had a past, and he had a future that would be dedicated to uncovering the truth, no matter where it led him, no matter what it cost him. He went to the churchyard the next morning. The ground was hard and frozen, the grass brown and brittle. He found the section where the unmarked graves were, a lonely, neglected corner of the yard, overgrown with weeds and brambles. He didn't know where to start. There were dozens of them, small, sunken patches of earth that spoke of forgotten lives and lonely deaths. He walked among them, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. He felt a sense of despair, a feeling that he was searching for a needle in a haystack. How could he find her, in this place of nameless sorrow? He was about to give up when he saw it. A small, flat stone, half buried in the earth, almost hidden by a tangle of thorny vines. It was different from the others, which were just mounds of dirt. This one had been placed there deliberately. He knelt down, his fingers brushing away the dirt and the dead leaves. There was something carved on it, the letters faint and weathered, but still legible. R.T. He stared at the initials, his heart pounding in his chest. Rowena Thorne. This was it. This was her grave. He felt a wave of emotion wash over him, a mixture of grief and relief, of sadness and a strange, fierce joy. He had found her. He had found his mother. He sat by the grave for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones. He told her about his life, about the church, about the saddlery, about the man he had become. He told her that he loved her, that he was sorry for the life she had lost, for the pain she had suffered. He promised her that he would not forget her, that he would make her proud. He promised her that he would find Jasper. He left the churchyard as the sun was beginning to set, a new resolve hardening in his heart. He knew what he had to do next. He had to go back to the beginning. He had to find out where she had come from, who she had been before she came to Elkrun. He had to follow the trail of a ghost. He went to the stagecoach office, a small, dusty room at the back of the general store. The station master was a wizened old man with a face like a dried apple and a memory that was as sharp as a tack. Callum showed him the name in the ledger. Rowena Thorne. Do you remember her? The old man squinted at the name, his lips moving silently as he read it. Thorne. Aye, I remember her. A pretty thing. Sad eyes. Came in on the stage from the east, in the fall of 47. He looked up at Callum, his eyes sharp and curious. Why are you asking about her? She was my mother, Callum said, the words still feeling new and strange on his tongue. The station master's eyes widened in surprise. Well, I'll be. I always wondered what happened to that baby. He shook his head, a look of pity on his face. A sad story, that one. A real sad story. Do you know where she came from? Callum asked. What town? The old man thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. She had a ticket from a place called Harmony Creek. It's a mining town up in the mountains. A rough place, from what I hear. Harmony Creek. The name was another piece of the puzzle, another step on the road to the truth. How do I get there? Callum asked. The station master gave him directions, his gnarled finger tracing a line on a dusty map on the wall. It was a long journey, 100 miles through rugged, unforgiving country. It would take him days, maybe weeks. He didn't care. He would walk if he had to. He thanked the old man and left, his mind already on the journey ahead. He went back to the saddlery, the place that had been his only home for the past 5 years. Mr. Abernathy was there, his face etched with worry. Callum, where have you been? I was about to send the sheriff after you. Callum looked at the old man, at the familiar, comforting sight of the leather and the tools and the half-finished saddles. It was a good life, a safe life. But it wasn't his life anymore. I'm leaving, Mr. Abernathy, he said, his voice steady. I have to go away for a while. The old man's face fell, his eyes full of a hurt surprise. Leaving? But why? Is it the pay? I can give you more. You're the best apprentice I've ever had, Callum. You've got a real gift. It's not about the money, Callum said. It's something I have to do, for my family. He didn't explain any further. He couldn't. The story was too new, too raw, too much his own. He packed his few belongings in a saddlebag, his hands moving with the sure, steady grace of a man who knew his trade. He took a bridle and a blanket, a knife and a small amount of money he had saved. He chose a horse from the stable, a strong, sturdy gelding with a calm, intelligent eye. He saddled the horse, his movements automatic, his mind 1,000 miles away, in a mining town called Harmony Creek. He was about to leave when Mr. Abernathy came out to the stable, a look of sad resignation on his face. He was holding something in his hand, a saddle. It was the one Callum had been working on, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, with intricate tooling and a deep, rich color. It's finished, the old man said, his voice thick with emotion. I finished it for you. It's yours. Callum looked at the saddle, his throat tight. It was the finest thing he had ever made, a testament to the years he had spent learning his craft. I can't take it, he said. I haven't earned it. Yes, you have, the old man said, his voice firm. You've earned it 100 times over. You're a good man, Callum. Whatever you're looking for, I hope you find it. He helped Callum put the saddle on the horse, his old hands gentle and sure. You'll always have a home here, son, he said, his voice breaking. Don't you ever forget that. Callum mounted the horse, the new leather creaking beneath him. He looked down at the old man, his heart full of a gratitude that he couldn't express. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate, but all he had. He turned the horse and rode out of the stable, not looking back. He rode out of Elkrun, the town where he had been born, the town that had been his whole world. He rode towards the mountains, towards the unknown, towards the ghost of a woman named Rowena Thorne and the shadow of a man named Jasper. He was no longer an orphan. He was a son on a quest, and he would not rest until he had found the truth. The journey to Harmony Creek was a hard one. The trail was steep and treacherous, winding its way through dense forests and over high, windswept passes. The days were cold and the nights were colder, the silence of the wilderness broken only by the cry of a hawk or the howl of a distant wolf. Callum was a man who was used to solitude, but this was a different kind of loneliness. It was a loneliness that was filled with ghosts, with the unanswered questions of his past. He thought of his mother, of the woman with the storm-gray eyes and the sad, quiet smile. He tried to imagine her life, the hopes and dreams she must have had, the love that had brought her to this wild, unforgiving country. He thought of Jasper, the man whose name was a whisper in a jailhouse ledger. Was he a good man? A man who had loved his mother? A man who had been the victim of some terrible misfortune? Or was he a villain, a man who had abandoned her, who had left her to die alone? He didn't know, and the not knowing was a torment, a constant gnawing ache in his heart. He rode on, driven by a need that was more powerful than hunger or thirst or fatigue. It was a need to know who he was, to understand the story that was written in his blood. He reached Harmony Creek after a week of hard riding. It was a raw, ugly town, clinging to the side of a mountain like a scab on a wound. The buildings were rough-hewn, unpainted shacks, thrown up in a hurry to house the miners who had come to seek their fortune in the gold-rich streams. The streets were rivers of mud, churned up by the constant traffic of men and mules and heavy-laden wagons. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and whiskey and unwashed bodies. It was a town without women, a town without children, a town without hope. It was a town that ate men alive. Callum rode down the main street, his eyes scanning the faces of the men he passed. They were a hard-bitten lot, their faces grim and weathered, their eyes full of a desperate, hungry greed. He felt a sense of unease, a feeling that he was an outsider, a lamb in a den of wolves. He found the only saloon in town, a noisy, smoke-filled place called the Gilded Cage. He tied his horse to the rail outside and went in, the sound of a tinny piano and loud, drunken laughter washing over him. He went to the bar, his hand resting on the butt of the knife in his belt. He was not a fighting man, but he was not a fool either. He knew that in a place like this, a man had to be ready for anything. He ordered a whiskey, the raw, fiery liquid burning a trail down his throat. He looked around the room, his eyes searching for a friendly face, for someone who might be willing to talk. He saw only suspicion and hostility. These were men who had come to the mountains to escape their pasts, to lose themselves in the anonymity of the wilderness. They were not men who welcomed questions. He was about to give up, to leave the saloon and try somewhere else, when he saw him. An old man, sitting alone at a table in the corner, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. He was different from the other miners. His clothes were clean, his face was intelligent, and his eyes, though clouded with drink, held a spark of something that looked like kindness. Callum took his drink and went over to the old man's table. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. The old man looked up, his eyes focusing on Callum with an effort. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice slurred. "The company's free." Callum sat down, the chair creaking under his weight. He took a sip of his whiskey, the silence stretching between them. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his voice low. "A man named Jasper." The old man's eyes narrowed, a flicker of interest in their cloudy depths. "Jasper," he said, the name rolling off his tongue like a familiar curse. "What do you want with him?" "He's my father," Callum said, the words coming out before he could stop them. The old man stared at him, his mouth hanging open in surprise. Then he threw back his head and laughed, a loud, braying sound that made the other miners turn and look. "Your father?" he roared. "Jasper Thorne, you poor bastard." The name hit Callum like a physical blow. Jasper Thorne. So that was his name. The name of the man who had abandoned his mother. The name of the man who was his father. "You know him?" Callum asked, his voice tight. "Know him?" the old man said, his laughter dying down to a wheezing chuckle. "Everybody in Harmony Creek knows Jasper Thorne, or knew him, I should say. He's been gone for years." "Where did he go?" Callum asked, his heart pounding. The old man shrugged, his eyes evasive. "Who knows? He left one day without a word to anyone. Just disappeared. Some say he struck it rich and went back east. Others say he ran into trouble with some of the other miners. He was a gambler, you see. A man who liked to take chances, and he wasn't always lucky." He took a long pull from the bottle, his eyes avoiding Callum's. He was a charmer, though. I'll give him that. He could talk a bird out of a tree. He had a way with the ladies, too. There was a girl, a pretty thing. She was sweet on him, followed him up here from somewhere down south, said she was going to marry him. Callum felt a cold dread creep over him. "What was her name?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The old man looked at him, his eyes full of a drunken pity. "Rowena," he said. Her name was Rowena. The saloon was suddenly silent, the noise and the laughter fading into a dull roar in Callum's ears. He felt the floor tilt beneath him, the faces of the miners blurring into a meaningless. The saloon was suddenly silent, the noise and the laughter fading into a dull roar in Callum's ears. He felt the floor tilt beneath him, the faces of the miners blurring into a meaningless tapestry of beards and grime. Rowena, his mother. She had followed Jasper Thorne to this God-forsaken place, believing in his promises, believing in his love. And he had left her. He had left her pregnant and alone, to make her way back through 100 miles of wilderness, to die in a jail cell in a town that didn't want her. The anger that had been simmering inside him for days erupted into a white-hot rage. He wanted to find Jasper Thorne, to feel the man's throat in his hands, to make him pay for the life he had destroyed. "Where is he?" Callum demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Someone here must know." The old miner, whose name was Silas, recoiled from the intensity in Callum's eyes. He shook his head, his drunken bravado gone, replaced by a genuine fear. "I swear, boy, I don't know. He was a ghost. He had a claim up on Whisperwind Ridge, a small one, but he never worked it much. Spent most of his time down here, at the card tables." Whisperwind Ridge, another name, another breadcrumb on a trail of sorrow. Callum stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. He threw a coin on the table, more than enough to cover his drink and Silas's bottle. "Thank you," he said, the words clipped and cold. He walked out of the saloon, the eyes of every man in the room following him. He felt their stares like a physical weight, a mixture of curiosity and menace. He was a stranger here, an unknown quantity, and in a town like Harmony Creek that made him a threat. He untied his horse, his movements quick and efficient. He didn't know the way to Whisperwind Ridge, but he would find it. He would ask, and if no one would tell him, he would search every ridge and every canyon until he found the place where his father had hidden from the world. He stopped at the general store, a place that also served as the town's assayer's office. The storekeeper was a thin, weaselly man with shifty eyes and a nervous twitch in his cheek. Callum laid the jailhouse ledger on the counter, opened to the page with his mother's name. He didn't speak, just pointed to the name Jasper scrawled in blood. The storekeeper's eyes widened. He licked his lips, his gaze darting around the empty store as if looking for an escape. "What's this about?" he stammered. "I'm looking for Jasper Thorne," Callum said, his voice flat and even. "I was told he had a claim on Whisperwind Ridge. I need to know where that is." The man swallowed hard. "Thorne. He's long gone, cleared out years ago, owed me money, the son of a bitch." The last part was muttered under his breath, but Callum heard it. He owed a lot of people, Callum said. I'm here to settle his accounts. All of them. The lie came easily to his lips. He would say whatever he had to say, do whatever he had to do. The storekeeper's greed warred with his fear. The prospect of getting his money back was a powerful incentive. He pulled out a large, detailed map of the mining claims from under the counter and spread it out. His grimy finger traced a path up into the high country. It's here, he said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. A 2-day ride if you push it. But the trail's washed out in places, and there's others up there. Men who don't take kindly to strangers. I'm not a stranger, Callum said, his eyes locking with the storekeeper's. I'm his son. The man's face went pale. He quickly folded the map and pushed it across the counter. Take it, he said. Just don't tell anyone I helped you. Callum took the map and left without another word. He rode out of Harmony Creek as the sun was beginning to dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains. He didn't look back. There was nothing for him in that town but the ghosts of his mother's broken dreams. The trail to Whisperwind Ridge was even more difficult than the storekeeper had described. It was a narrow, winding track that clung to the side of the mountain, with a sheer drop on one side and a wall of rock on the other. In places, the trail had been completely washed away by landslides, and Callum had to dismount and lead his horse, his boots slipping on the loose scree. He rode for 2 days, the silence of the high country pressing in on him. He saw no one, heard nothing but the wind whistling through the pines and the steady, rhythmic plod of his horse's hooves. The air grew thinner, colder. The world seemed to shrink, to become a place of only rock and sky and the relentless driving force of his own will. He thought of his mother, making this same journey, her heart full of hope, her body already carrying the secret of his life. Had she been afraid? Had she felt the same crushing loneliness, the same sense of being a small, insignificant creature in a vast, indifferent wilderness? He felt a new wave of love for her, a fierce, protective love that was mixed with a profound and bottomless grief. He was living her journey in reverse, traveling back in time to the place where her story had taken its tragic turn. He found the claim late on the second day. It was a small, desolate clearing on the side of the ridge, marked by a collapsed lean-to and a shallow, abandoned mine shaft. The place had an air of failure and despair about it, as if the very ground was saturated with the bitterness of a broken man. Callum dismounted, his legs stiff and sore. He walked to the edge of the mine shaft and looked down. It was a dark, gaping maw, a wound in the earth. He could see the marks of a pickaxe on the rock, the signs of a desperate, fruitless search for a treasure that was never there. This was his father's legacy, a hole in the ground. He turned his attention to the lean-to. It was a pathetic structure, made of rotting logs and strips of bark. It had long since collapsed under the weight of the winter snows. He kicked at the debris, his anger and frustration building with every step. He had come all this way, endured so much, for this? For a pile of rubble and a hole in the ground? He was about to turn away, to admit defeat, when his boot struck something hard. He knelt down and brushed away the dirt and the pine needles. It was a small metal box, rusted and dented, but still intact. He pried it open with his knife, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed, crumbling newspaper, was a small, leather-bound book, a journal, and on the first page, in a neat, elegant hand that was so different from the scrawl in the jailhouse ledger, was a name: Jasper Thorne. Callum sat down on a fallen log, the journal in his hands. He felt a strange reluctance to open it, to read the words of the man who was his father. He was afraid of what he might find. He was afraid of the truth. But he had come too far to turn back now. He took a deep breath and opened the journal. The first entries were full of hope and optimism. Jasper Thorne wrote of his love for Rowena, of his dreams of striking it rich and building a life with her. He wrote of his journey to Harmony Creek, of the promise of the goldfields, of the bright, shining future that lay before them. But as the pages turned, the tone of the journal began to change. The entries became shorter, more sporadic. The hope was replaced by a growing sense of frustration and despair. The gold was elusive, the work was backbreaking, the other miners were hostile and suspicious. The dream was turning into a nightmare. And then came the gambling. At first, it was just a way to pass the time, to escape the crushing boredom and loneliness of the mining camp. But it quickly became an obsession, a fever that consumed him. He wrote of his wins, the brief, exhilarating moments of triumph that made him feel like a king. And he wrote of his losses, the long, dark nights of despair when he gambled away everything he had, and more. He wrote of Rowena. He wrote of her letters, of her unwavering faith in him, of her gentle, loving spirit. He wrote of his guilt, of his shame, of the growing chasm between the man he was and the man she believed him to be. He was living a lie, and the lie was eating him alive. The last entry was dated the day before he disappeared. It was a short, desperate scrawl, the words barely legible. "I've lost everything, the claim, the money, everything. I owe a man, a dangerous man. He says if I don't pay him by tomorrow, he'll kill me. There's only one way out. I have to run. I have to disappear. Forgive me, Rowena. Forgive me." Callum closed the journal, the words a blur through the tears that were streaming down his face. He felt a strange mixture of emotions. Pity for the weak, broken man his father had been, and a new, deeper anger. An anger not at a villain, but at a coward. A man who had run away from his responsibilities, who had chosen his own life over the lives of the woman who loved him and the child she carried. He stood up, his mind clear, his purpose renewed. He knew what he had to do. He had to find the man his father had owed money to. He had to find out what had really happened on that last, fateful day. He went back to Harmony Creek, the journal tucked safely in his saddlebag. He went back to the gilded cage, the place where his father's downfall had begun. He found Silas, the old miner, in the same corner, with the same bottle of whiskey. Callum sat down opposite him, the journal in his hand. "I found this," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "In my father's cabin. It tells me he owed a man money. A dangerous man. Do you know who that might have been?" Silas's eyes widened as he saw the journal. He seemed to sober up instantly, his face pale with a fear that was more than just the fear of a stranger. "You shouldn't have gone up there," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's not safe." "I'm not looking for safety," Callum said. "I'm looking for the truth. Who was the man, Silas?" The old miner looked around the room, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. He leaned forward, his voice so low that Callum could barely hear him. "His name is Blackwood, Marcus Blackwood. He runs this town. He owns the saloon, the store, the assay office. He owns the miners. He's the one my father owed money to. The weaselly storekeeper, the man who had given him the map, he was in on it. They were all in on it. The whole town was a web of lies and deceit, with Marcus Blackwood at its center, a spider growing fat on the misery of others." "Where can I find him?" Callum asked. Silas shook his head, his eyes pleading. "Leave it be, son. Blackwood is not a man to be trifled with. He's a killer. He's the one who ran your father out of town." "He didn't run him out of town," Callum said, his voice cold and hard as steel. "He killed him, didn't he?" Silas didn't answer. He just stared at Callum, his face a mask of terror, but his silence was answer enough. Callum stood up, the journal still in his hand. He knew what he had to do. He had to face Marcus Blackwood. He had to make him pay for his father's death, for his mother's sorrow, for the life that had been stolen from him before he was even born. He walked to the back of the saloon, to the door that led to Blackwood's office. He didn't knock. He kicked the door open and stepped inside. Blackwood was sitting behind a large, ornate desk, a fat, unlit cigar clamped between his teeth. He was a big man, with a florid face and small, cold eyes. He looked up as Callum came in, his face showing no surprise, only a kind of bored amusement. "Well, well," he said, his voice a low, rumbling growl. "The prodigal son returns. I've been expecting you." Callum said nothing. He just stood there, his hand resting on the butt of his knife, his eyes locked on Blackwood's. He let the silence stretch, let the tension build. He wanted the man to feel his fear, to know that this was not a game. "What do you want?" Blackwood asked, his amusement beginning to fade, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "I want the truth," Callum said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a lifetime of pain. "About my father. About Jasper Thorne." Blackwood laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Your father was a fool, a weak, pathetic fool who didn't know when to quit. He owed me money, a lot of money. He couldn't pay, so I took his claim, and I took his life." The confession was so blunt, so devoid of remorse, that it took Callum's breath away. He had expected denials, lies, evasions. Not this casual, brutal admission of murder. "You killed him," Callum said, his voice a whisper. "I did what I had to do," Blackwood said, his eyes cold and hard. "He was a loose end, and I don't like loose ends." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And now you're a loose end, boy. You and that journal. You should have stayed away. You should have let the past lie buried." He reached for a drawer in his desk, his hand moving with a speed that belied his bulk. But Callum was faster. He had been waiting for this, expecting it. He drew his knife and threw it in a single fluid motion. The blade flew across the room and buried itself in Blackwood's hand, pinning it to the desk. Blackwood roared in pain and rage, his other hand fumbling for the gun in his shoulder holster. But Callum was already on him. He vaulted over the desk, his hands closing around Blackwood's throat. He was not a killer. He had never taken a human life. But in that moment, he was filled with a cold, righteous fury that was more powerful than any fear, any hesitation. He was his mother's son, his father's avenger. He was the storm that had been gathering for 20 years. He squeezed, his thumbs pressing into the soft flesh of Blackwood's throat. The man's face turned purple, his eyes bulging from their sockets. He clawed at Callum's hands, his struggles growing weaker, more frantic. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the rage was gone. It was replaced by a great, empty sadness. He looked down at the man he was killing, at the face contorted in a mask of terror and agony. And he saw not a monster, but a man. A weak, greedy, pathetic man who had built his life on the misery of others. He let go. Blackwood fell back in his chair, gasping for air, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and terror. Callum stood over him, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. He had faced the devil, and he had won. But the victory was hollow, tasteless. It had not brought his parents back. It had not erased the pain of the past. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving Blackwood to his fate. He walked out of the saloon, out of the town of Harmony Creek. He didn't look back. There was nothing for him there but the ghosts of a life that might have been. He rode back to El Crun, the journey a blur of motion and memory. He went to the churchyard, to the unmarked grave of his mother. He sat by the small, flat stone, the journal in his hand. He read it to her, his voice soft in the quiet of the twilight. He told her the story of her life, of her love, of her betrayal. He told her that he knew the truth. He told her that he had found her peace. He stayed there until the sun came up, a new day dawning on a new world. He was no longer a boy searching for his past. He was a man who had found his future. He knew who he was. He was the son of Rowena Thorne and Jasper Thorne. He was a man who had been forged in the crucible of sorrow and loss, a man who had faced the darkness and emerged into the light. He went back to the saddlery. Mr. Abernathy was there, his face lighting up with a mixture of relief and joy when he saw Callum. He didn't ask any questions. He just put his hand on Callum's shoulder, a silent gesture of welcome and acceptance. Callum went to his workbench, to the saddle that was waiting for him. He took out his knife, the same knife that had pinned a killer's hand to a desk. And with a steady, sure hand, he began to carve a name into the rich, dark leather. Not his own name, not the name of his father, but the name of the woman who had given him life, the woman who had given him a story, Rowena. He scratched her name into his saddle and rode without turning back.